yesterday just to kind of practice because I hadn't done this painting in a long time. And this is what I came up with. And it's a lot of light and shadow. And we're not going to worry too much about the background. We're going to create somewhat of an abstract interpretation for our background. But the main thing I want to talk about before we get started is our palette. We're going to work with a fairly limited palette. And this morning I put together a couple of colors here. I mentioned in the email that Lois sent out that I might be using raw sienna, orange, burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, and then there was a couple of really light colors like a sand color or a fleshy color. And I have both buff titanium and I have a Wand Brilliant #1. I don't really use this enough to warrant putting it in my palette, but I have a tube of it. And here's the Wand Brilliant #1 is a Holbein. The buff titanium is a Daniel Smith. Any light color is easier than having to mix it. I did mix up almost identical color over here on the left, which is a mixture of raw sienna, raw umber, and a little bit of cool yellow, very watered down, and you get an approximate color. And all I was trying to do is get that lighter, semi-warm, light shade of or tone of stucco. But then this morning, what I did is I put together a series of the colors we're going to be using. The raw sienna is a warm beige. Gamboge is kind of an Indian yellow, warm yellow. It looks a little bit darker here on the camera, but it's kind of a brighter yellow. I have a transparent orange that I use. It's a very true staining. Well, it's very transparent, but it's nice true orange. And then the burnt sienna that I use is a quinacridone burnt orange, but it's the same cinnamon color that's a nice earthy burnt sienna. I have used a little bit of pyro red in this painting, and I wanted to show you how when you take the orange and you add a little bit of ultramarine blue to it, you get a really lively dark. And then to get it even darker in places, I take a little bit of pyro red, a little bit of orange, and a little bit of ultramarine blue, and you get this really deep, rich dark. And we're going to want to really, extend and go out to the edges of our range in values to get some true darks and then some very light lights, and all more or less on the warm side. There's going to be a few accent colors in this painting, a little bit of a kind of a golden green or an apple green, a little bit of the cobalt blue, and some phthalo blue or turquoise. So, but just to kind of give you a familiarity with where we're going in order to end up with a painting that looks approximately like this. And in Lucca, those of you who have your photo reference printed out, it's a kind of a very old city in Tuscany. It's got this beautiful patina on these weathered buildings with clay rooftops, stucco facades that have all kinds of weathering to them and water stains and so on that gives it a lot of character. Anyway, what I wanted to do is give you an idea of the color palette that we'll be extending once we get this thing finished. So I'm going to set this aside and go back to my line drawing. I pressed down pretty hard with my pencil so that you could see this on camera. I don't recommend doing too strong of a drawing because you don't want the drawing to overtake the painting. At some point as I'm drying this, I may go back in and erase some of these lines just so that they don't distract. But I added, from our photo reference, a little bit of laundry lines that you see occasionally in some of these Tuscany cities, going from balcony to balcony or rooftop to facade. And it helps break up that space. But the first step, what we're going to do, this may seem a little strange to you, but I'm going to take a big brush and I'm going to just wet my paper. We're going to start off wet and wet. I'm on
Randy, can I just interrupt you for one moment? I've got two questions about colors. Someone's saying they haven't got burnt sienna, what else could they use? And someone's saying they haven't got pyro red, what else could they use?
Well, pyro red is like cadmium red, any warm red. that they've got. There's two types of red. There's a cool red, which has more blue in it. And then there's a warm red, which has more orange in it. We're going to stay on the warm side with our reds. Whatever red you happen to have handy, if you just add a little orange to it or a little yellow to it, you're going to get a warm red. So that should handle that. Burnt sienna, you can take probably a little bit of orange and a little bit of ultramarine, and you'll get burnt sienna. So that should handle that. Anyway, back to what I was saying. I'm going to use this big brush, and I'm going to completely wet my paper. I have my paper on a board taped all the way down because it's 300-pound paper. It's the heavier weight watercolor paper. Today I'm working on Fabriano bright white or natural, or I can't remember what they call it. I call it bright white, so that it shows my negative shapes off pretty well, which are illuminated in the light source. If you're working on 140-pound, the lighter weight cold press watercolor paper, just clip it at the top two corners or put a little piece of tape on the top two corners, because as we get this paper totally wet, to start off wet and wet, your paper is going to expand. Even the 300-pound will start to bow up a little bit, because as it soaks up that water, it will expand a little bit. And if your lighter weight paper, like 140-pound paper, is trapped with tape all the way around, it will just rise up like a roller coaster and just start making these big deep troughs, and all your color will run down into those troughs. So just clip them or tape them up in the upper corners, and as your paper expands, you can pull up that little bit of tape and relieve the corners, and then retape it down after it expands. So as I wet my brush and get a full load of water on here, I'm just going to go very gently back and forth across my painting. And you can see what happens with that lead when you get it wet. It just starts running everywhere. So that's why I try not to draw my drawing too dark. But most of it's just going to disappear when we start painting anyway, so it doesn't matter. But I want to get my paper nice and wet. And then I'm going to use a little smaller brush to work with. I have a 1.5 inch flat brush, and I'm going to start with my lighter colors. I'll get a little bit of this beige color, this One Brilliant #1. Squirt a little bit of it in my palette because I don't use it on one of my wells. And I'm just going to get that nice and worked into my brush so I have a full charge. And in the stuccoed areas, I'm just going to bring a little bit of this down while it's wet and just add a little bit of warmth to some of these whites in the area where there's going to be some shadow. And you can see it just gives a nice warmth that's, and I'm just painting right over everything because we'll just let this all kind of run down. And I'll pick up a little bit of raw sienna as well, drop a little of that in there in a few spots. Because it's so wet, this paint just more or less runs. And as I get farther out away from the center of interest here, I'll leave a little bit of white on some of the sides of the facade. My light is coming from the upper right and going down to the lower left. So that's the direction of my light source. And I want to keep some of those surfaces that are facing the light much lighter in value. So go ahead. Was there a question?
No, she unmuted by her mistake.
Oh, okay. Anyway, you can see dropping.
What colors to mix for the bluff?
Oh, just a little bit of raw sienna, a little raw umber, and some cool yellow, and then water it down pretty good. So it's not real saturated. You want to dilute it, otherwise it comes off too dark. But you can get the same color. So now with the surface nice and wet and the water has soaked in, I'm going to clean my brush, and I'm going to pick up a really rich, a little bit drier mix of orange pigment, my transparent orange. And this won't be the final color on my rooftops, but I want to make sure that I keep this pigment a little bit drier because my paper is already wet. And I'm just going to come in and just drop in a little bit of this orange where these rooftops are. And if it runs a little bit, that's okay. We want it to have an opportunity to kind of move around in the surfaces here that we're working. And if it starts to bleed over, I'm going to take out one of the rolls of tape under my board so that I don't have quite as much of an angle on this. And I'm just going to work my way across a couple of these shapes where the rooftops are, and let this water just kind of run across all these rooftops with this nice orange color. And I'll just drop a little bit more orange into this area on this lower little shed roof structure that's coming towards the viewers. And now you can see my paint is starting to bleed up into my background. Some of it will bleed down into my my lower areas of my stucco. That's great. I don't mind that because now I can kind of see where the light is shining on some of these surfaces and where some of it is eventually going to be in shadow. So I'm coming right up against my corners, come down behind some of these structures that are coming towards us, and just dropping in this really light, soft watercolor wash that just has a gentleness to it and soft character to it, so that I can come back with a drier brush and drop in some other colors later. But right now I'm just getting the basic underpainting tone down into these different surfaces, or these little shapes that I've defined with my pencil drawing. And even though all my pencils started running, now that I've started introducing a little bit of color in here, it doesn't really matter. I'm going to pull a little bit of this tone right up around the background, softening some of these shapes. I want to get my little smokestacks or whatever they are, the chimneys, tinted a little bit before I start drying. So we're going to just allow this to all just kind of run. And some of you may have wetter paper than others, and don't worry about it. If it runs everywhere, that's okay. That's just great. We want that real soft background, wet and wet look to all this surface that we're working on. All right. At this point, I'm going to take a clean flat brush that's about a 1 inch, a little more control, a little bit stiffer, and I can come back in and maybe clean up a few areas where I got some of this orange coming down over some of these surfaces. I'm going to actually pick up a little bit of raw umber, just a slightly darker version with some raw sienna, and maybe add a little bit of orange to that. So it's just a little darker. And I'm going to drop this in to the inside of some of these little wall surfaces so that we start to see and feel some darker shapes. It'll be pretty subtle. They don't have to be perfect. You're just kind of drop these in to create shadow tone. Come down this one corner here where this building and the stucco starts to come down, the vertical surface. And then I'll come back in with a little bit darker right along these edges here. And if everything is going according to plan on your painting, all these rooftops should sort of be running up into the background and just creating sort of a hazy, warm tone behind these rooftops. We can then come back in and get a really much drier mix of the orange and then add a little bit of hot red or warm red. And I'm going to really punch up part of this rooftop, clean my brush, and just soften that dark red as it moves from the right to the left across that shape, so that it has just a really nice hot surface on one side. I'll come back in with that same color and drop it down because this rooftop is a little bit lower than the adjacent one. And we'll just soften it and just take a little bit of a clean brush and just gently soften it so that the red goes intense on the left and runs a little lighter and lighter over to the right. And eventually we'll get all the way over to this third little segment of rooftop. And I'm just going to bring a little bit of that's on my brush and just very lightly blend it in with the orange tops. Now you can see all of a sudden we've got this really beautiful deep red and orange that's in our rooftop. I'm starting to get a big bloom here and I don't really care. That's okay. I'm just going to wipe my brush off and just drop some of this color right into that rooftop. and allow some of this drier mixture of the red over here on the lower right corner or lower left corner, and then clean my brush, wipe all the water off of it, and just blend that back up into the orange surface. So there's our basic rooftops. We may want to get a little bit of raw umber, not the hot red, but just some raw umber and a little bit of gamboge possibly, and maybe punch up the value of the leading edge of this one rooftop over here on the right that's moving away from us, but not give it the hot red look that we had before. We just want to keep that fairly neutral. So at this point, we're ready. I want you to finish this and go ahead and do it. I'm going to dry my painting, but if anybody has questions, speak up, unmute your mic, or put it in the chat for Lois. But the important thing is at this point, we're going to want to eventually completely dry our paper. I'm going to add a little bit of darker orange up into this chimney here, and it's just come right across the shape. It doesn't matter if you go outside the lines. We're just going to blend that background right up into the back above the rooftops and let that all just kind of run together. So if anybody gets to this point, you want to dry your paper, and we really need to have this paper completely dry before we go on to the next stage, because we're going to start cutting in and defining our rooftops with a real rich dark color that'll be beautiful. And I left some areas in here that are free for some greenery. You know, they put these nice planters and pots and things with rooftop greenery. So we'll have little spots of green here and there, but don't worry too much about it. The main thing is get it dry so we can come back in and then cut in around these rooftops.
What was the red that you used? Was that the Pyrrole red? I think I have Pyrrole Scarlet.
You could try that. Just add a little orange to it, so it's just a nice, really warm red or a reddish orange.
Okay, thank you.
I'm just taking this opportunity now to make sure my paper is dry, and I like the soft edges of these rooftops, how they kind of run down into the vertical surfaces of the buildings nicely in a few places. We can actually, once we get it dry, we can even pop in a few more reds, because I'll tell you what's going to happen. A lot of this, when we dry it, the red is going to soften and get lighter in value. And we may want to punch it up a little bit more before we come in with our background color. So I'm just trying to get most of the water to evaporate, dry. So when I take a big flat brush with a dark color, I can cut in around these rooftop shapes and really give a nice definition to the building shapes.
Randy, once in one of the other lessons, you mentioned the brand name of your transparent orange that you really love. Could you repeat that?
It's Schminke, S-C-H-M-I-N-C-K-E, Schminke. I think it's Dutch. I'm not sure, German, but it's I don't have a lot of other Schminke colors, but that one color I just really love is a beautiful orange. It's very, very transparent. So
thank you.
Yeah. I'm checking my paper, making sure if you need to take a tissue and just kind of wick up around the edges so none of this water that might have pooled around the edge of your painting creeps into your painting. It helps promote the drying. You can touch the paper with the back of your hand and you can feel if it's a little bit cool. If it still feels cool, that means it's still damp inside and you want to get it nice and dry. This lower part of my paper here is very damp or very cool. So I want to make sure I get all of this dried as well. One of the things that I did on my drawing that I don't think it shows up on the photo reference that well, but I had a drain pipe kind of zigzagging down the vertical side of this facade and then running at an angle across the facade out to the corner and coming down. And it just breaks up this long, uninterrupted edge of this shape. Anything you can do to break up predictable edges any kind of uninterrupted line or edge in a painting draws attention. And if it's not in your center of interest, you probably don't want to draw that much attention to it. So we want to have a lot of lost and found edges within our painting so that it becomes more natural looking. All right, I'm going to go back to using my same brush, and I'm going to pull up my my little palette here that I did these mixtures on. If you look at this, do you see this dark color that was the burnt sienna, ultramarine, and pyro red or cadmium red? It's a warm red mixed with the warm blue mixed with the burnt sienna. It's going to make a really lush, rich dark. And we're not going to want to have our background behind these buildings completely the same color. We want to have a lot of variety and variation within those. So we're going to be going back and forth to our palette, picking up a little bit more orange, a little bit more red, a little bit more ultramarine as we move through this. And you're going to be working with a fairly wet mixture, a wet charge of paint on your brush, so that the paint will flow. And one puddle of dark pigment may flow into a lighter puddle of, say, orange or red. And then other places it may just be a very light transparent orange. So what that will do is we'll create a tremendous amount of very loose background. But because our paper is now dry, and you touch your paper, you can feel around the tops of these rooftops. Are they dry? So that as you go to mix up, I'm going to swing my camera over here, as we start to mix up some burnt sienna, which is, I'm using this really rich, dark quinacridone burnt orange in lieu of burnt sienna, but burnt sienna is the same color basically. I'm going to mix in a little bit of pyro red to make it just that much brighter, and then a little bit of ultramarine. And all of a sudden, when you start adding that ultramarine, it takes it down to a really rich, dark color, but it's also very transparent. It has a nice, rich quality to it. And the reason I want this dark is I want to create a lot of contrast between the background and these rooftops. These rooftops are the name of the game. That's what we're after here. So see if I can't get my camera positioned properly so that you can see what I'm about to do. Let's see, move it this way. All right. Now I have a couple of little smokestack shapes coming up out of the rooftop. I'm going to take my flat, and this is why I'm using a flat. I'm going to lay it down right next to that smokestack and come straight across with this really rich dark and create these nice little shapes. And then I'll just come right, add a little bit more water to that and bring it right out to the edge of the paper. Come back into the other side of that little chimney. And by having a lot of water on my brush and having a nice crisp, sharp edge on this flat, I can work right up against that nice rooftop edge and drop in some pretty dramatic darks. I'm going to add a little bit more red right out of the palette and mix it with this wet shape that's going in on my painting. I'll see what I'm doing now, how dark this is. And you can add a little bit of water to your brush, add a little bit of orange maybe, but up against that nice light warm color that we did for the stucco, all of a sudden we're creating this very fluid, loose background that is just rich with warmth, but it's also very dark. So I'm going to add just some really intense little bits of ultramarine blue into these puddles of water, coming down to this little drain pipe. And I want to make sure I go around it so that we see it coming out away from the building, and then maybe drop in a little bit of dark up against the building so that we see that it's extending out away from the building just a bit. And I'm using the flat edge of my brush to be able to get all these details delineated. I'll just drop in maybe a little bit of orange in here. We'll just drop in a really nice rich bit of orange and reds. I'm going to continue up over the other side of the rooftop. And if your brush leaves a big wet mark that's very transparent, that means you don't have enough paint on your brush. you need to go back in and really charge up your brush with a deeper, darker, drier mixture of pigment, and just use the flat of your brush to come across the rooftops. And then we can add more ultramarine and a little bit of the warm red, and maybe come right up to create a nice vertical shape. And I'm going to add a little bit of blue to make this really dark and just drop it into some of these wet areas. And then go in the other direction with the brush handle or the brush edge and just soften it and run it away from the rooftop. And as I come over here with this kind of squared off chimney shape, I can get the little divots where it kind of tucks in around the architectural detailing using the flat of my brush. But look how fast we can create a dramatic edge to this painting. And these rooftops all of a sudden take shape almost instantaneously, simply by using the value contrast, getting the dark warms up against these really pale, lighter values of warmth. Come down around these rooftops and just make sure you change the little edges, because these rooftops all have little ups and downs and divots and changes to them. And I'm going to add a little bit more water up in here just to get this a little lighter, a little more fluid. Maybe come in a little bit right behind this other rooftop with a little bit of water, just to make this one little section feel like it's a little more neutral in shape. Get a little red in there possibly. But now, as we start working around this shape, everything should still be pretty wet. And if you need to, you can adjust or darken or do whatever adjustments you think are necessary. I'm even going to take a little bit of raw sienna and drop a little bit of that in there. And you can see what it does. It starts to repel some of the pigments and create a little bit lighter, softer values up inside all of these darks. Might even try a little bit of gamboge and drop a little bit of that in there. And it just starts playing and moving around within these wet shapes so that you get a variety of values. Come back in and get some really rich, dark ultramarine. Cut in around this chimney to make this chimney even more dramatic. And I like up in this corner, I want to get in the upper left corner, I'm going to get this a little darker. Just to draw attention to this one rooftop over here on this side. And I'll just kind of work down around it. But you want to maybe go from a lighter area over on the right, and as it moves across the painting in the background, it gets darker and darker.
We've got a few pleas for you to slow down, but I think just everybody know that you can watch the video afterwards if you're having problems. But just so you know, Randy, I've got a couple of people saying, I can't keep up, okay?
Well, what we're doing is we're allowing the water in all this shape to move these dark pigments around. And if you let everything dry, all you're going to see is a lot of very busy brush strokes. So we really want to keep moving through this little bit of background around the perimeter of these rooftops to delineate them and make them a very strong contrast so that we can see the difference between the background and the rooftops. We're going to come in, put a lot of shadows. We're going to put a lot of detail in these buildings later. But this is probably one of the key parts of the painting, is to lay in this variety of really dark values. They're all very warm, but having a little bit of ultramarine dropped in a few places really helps to punch up the contrast that defines these shapes. And I'm dropping in a little bit more ultramarine blue, and you'll have plenty of time to do this because the paper is still pretty wet. And as long as that paper is still wet, we can go back and drop in a little bit more darks here and there. And I like the use of the ultramarine next to the warm red because it really creates that variety within these background shapes. But as we get down lower, I want to try to get this a little lighter. I might even drop in a little bit of water on there just to get it to bloom a little, because I want my value contrast to be up in the upper left side of this painting, which is where the greatest contrast will be, so that we know that that's the center of interest up in there. I can come back in with a, reshape some of these little chimney stacks as however is necessary. I like some of the little bit lighter values we're getting in a few places. It adds a tremendous amount of variety and richness to that background.
Someone's asking what kind of 1-inch brush you use, because hers doesn't hold the water very well.
I discovered these Da Vinci brushes. They're called spin brushes by Da Vinci, and they have the sharpest little edge on them, and they hold a ton of water. Now, I also have a 1-inch flat that's a Sterling Edwards brush. It's really more for acrylic, and it gives me the ability to blend, but it doesn't hold as much water. So you're right. Some flats hold a lot of water, some don't. And you have to experiment until you find the one that you like. And I particularly like this Da Vinci flat. It's a marvelous brush and allows me to do a whole myriad of things to it with it. And what I really like about it is this sharp edge in the corner, so that I can work in around shapes like these rooftops and really create some beautiful little edge detail. And I do it all just with the corner of this flat brush. But now some of these shapes are bleeding into some of our building shot. The rooftops that are way in the back here, they're not as important. So I'm going to take a little bit of water and just lightly let some of that background bleed right down into part of that rooftop. We got some others. We'll come back and cut in behind it later after this dries. But having this wet and wet approach really allows a lot of beautiful things to happen, where we let the water work the paint. Now, I can take a rigger and just put a little bit of water on it, and I can just tap a little bit of this water into some of these backgrounds that are wet, and it creates these little dewdrops and texture, and it'll start blooming and creating even more variety back in that background. It won't do anything to the buildings because they're dry, but wherever the background is wet and we sprinkle a little bit of water in there, you're going to get some amazing little effects. I just really enamored with what the water will do to the paint. And when people get worried that I'm going too fast, what I'm really trying to do is get the entire shape very wet and introduce a variety of colors within that wet shape while the paint is still up on the surface, and that water moves the pigment around to create these amazing little tendrils and blooms and mixtures of color that run in and out from warm to cool and cool to warm, that create this tremendous variety within the background without having actually any shapes back there. So we can imagine there's all kinds of stuff happening without it really having to be too careful back there. It's all about coming in and around these shapes that we've already penciled in as our rooftops and the corners of the one building over here on the left. So I think you can see how quickly this transforms to a recognizable shape just by putting those darks in against this softer rooftop area that we put in. So at this point, I kind of need to dry this. I think we're ready to kind of move to another stage. So if you're getting caught up with some of this background, when you do, go ahead and dry it. Take a hair dryer, you're muted, let it evaporate some of that excess water. Let some of the paint just move around and create these rich tendrils of movement that indicate where things are happening. If you feel like it's dried prematurely, you can always use a little mister bottle. I've got one of these little spray bottles that eject a very fine mist, and you can always just kind of renew a little bit of the moisture in that background, and it lifts the paint and moves it across an area that might have dried too quickly, and it freshens it up a little bit. So you're always able to retrieve and lift without even touching it with a brush. And you'll be have a softer background that way. If you just give a quick little spritz of a mist into your heavier paint, and it lifts that pigment back up off the surface and moves it across where there might have been a prematurely drying line that drew attention. And you'll be a lot happier, I think, with it. So don't ever feel like this paint is, when it's down, that's it. You have lots of opportunity to kind of move things around if you need to. I'm going to, while we're waiting for that, I'm going to take this rigger. It's just slightly damp at this point. I'm going to pull some of that background color right through this little architectural indentation underneath that chimney, and just kind of create an edge over here. So we feel like one side of that is getting light and one side of it's in a fairly subtle shadow. I'm going to add a little bit more of the blue out of my mixing palette right up along the edge here, just to create the impression that there's a corner there. Doesn't take much to do that. Once this starts to kind of dry, we're going to go back in and punch up our roofs a little bit. You know where I sprayed this over here in the corner on the upper right? Some of that red is running down into my rooftops pretty obnoxiously. So I just take a tissue. I can just wipe it off. It still has a soft edge. It's not going to draw too much attention to it, but all that water was running downhill, and you can recapture things very quickly with just a tissue. You can even take a small flat brush and you can soften an edge if you think it's getting a little bit too hard edged, which is what I'm doing there. And not it's very pliable, very malleable. You can go back in and pick things up fairly quickly. Once you've got it where you want it, get back in there with a hairdryer and dry it so that it doesn't keep running. I'm going to evaporate some of this water so that basically stays the way I painted it, instead of having water run across it and get darker and darker. Okay, I think if everybody feels like they're getting something that replicates what I've got here, we want to start building up some shadows. This is still not going to be the final, business, but we'll be able to use the same brush. But I want to get just more of a neutral color. So I'm going to swing my camera over and show you. I'm just taking some of this blue and orange in my palette and creating a neutral. It's a cooler color. I'm going to add a little bit of the raw sienna to that. And you can see it's just sort of a milky, like a watered down chocolate milk color. And I'll bring this back to the painting. And I'm going to leave a little bit of the a bit of negative shape for the drain pipe that's coming down. Clean my brush, and now it's just wet. I'm just going to dilute it and just kind of drag and draw this neutral color down the length of this building. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to pick up a little bit of a cool color, maybe I don't know, try a little turquoise or blue. We'll try a little bit of orange in here. We'll just kind of change it up and allow ourselves to get darker in places. And because that's wet, if you drop a different color in there, like orange, it doesn't go anywhere. It just kind of softens and gives you a little bit warmer flavor through the building. And we're now creating a patina, and I'm going to come diagonally underneath this drain pipe, run it down so it tucks in behind this little parapet wall with this patio is on it. And we'll get this darker up against that parapet wall so we see that change. And all of a sudden, because we've left that little patio parapet wall a lighter value, it feels like it's come forward.
Randy, could you just revise the neutral mix for the building, please?
I just took a bunch of dirty water that was in my palette, but it had some ultramarine in it, and it had a little bit of raw sienna, and it might have had a little red tint to it. But it's what it does is it just gives you this pretty neutral, kind of unrecognizable color that gives you this sort of a patina color, but it puts this whole side of the building in shadow. Now, I want to take a little bit of water. I'm going to clean this big brush and just wipe all the water off and pick up a little of that wet paint just by pushing my wet brush across or damp brush across it. And then I can pick up a little bit of maybe turquoise, and we'll drop a little turquoise in there. Maybe we'll get a little bit underneath this drain pipe here just to, and because the surface of this shape is wet, none of these colors stay in any one place. They just kind of move around. I'm going to take a little bit of orange and drop a little of that in behind, down towards the bottom, so that this building's getting a little warmer as it goes down the side towards the bottom of the painting. And you can see it's just very loose how this, because this whole shape is so wet. And I can go right across these darks now and drag that same color into that drain pipe. And we go from a transition from a little bit cooler and lighter up here to warmer and darker mid-tone as we get down lower. I'm going to also pick up maybe a little bit of a warm violet. It's like a quinacridone violet, and drop that in to a couple of spots here. And then just take my board and tip it up and let the water kind of run across that shape. Maybe even blow on it a little bit. And you'll be able to see that that shape starts to, the water is moving that color around. I can even drop a little bit of water into that, bring it up closer to the corner where the light turns into a shadow. And we start to really feel like we've got a lot of variety happening within that shape. I'm going to wick up any of that excess water from the bottom because I'm on an angle. The water's running downhill. I'm going to wick up some of these puddles that I've got here and allow, so it basically it will dry evenly, even though there's lots of there's a great variety of color within that. So get a fresh tissue, any place where you've dribbled water, just pick it up and should be fine. We'll get shadows in here that define some of this stuff a little bit later. But for now, I'm just creating a really nice, soft, neutral. I'm going to put a little bit cool up in here. Drop just a little bit of very light cobalt mixed with some of the stuff in my palette. Pull a little bit over to the other side of this drain pipe. So we got some darks up against it. And we'll let that dry. And I'll let you get caught up. So that's kind of we put this whole side of the building in shadow, but look how rich all the shadows are. I mean, it's just all runny and lots of variety within those colors. So we don't have to worry about anything being too pristine. This is a historic town. It's been there for centuries, and it's got all kinds of colors within that stucco surface that gives it a richness. Once this is dry, we'll put some more shadows in there. But for now, I want to think about where we're going to go next. So go ahead and finish that up, and then we'll start popping in some other colors. I'm going to work across this three-tiered, there's three buildings here, or three facades that are all kind of part of the same main building. And we'll work our shadows in to those next planes, those next horizontal planes that are above that shed roof and where the laundry is. So, but we've got to let this kind of dry, and I want to give you a chance to get caught up enough so that you feel like we're not hurrying you. So while you're doing that, I'm going to pick up a little bit of a dribble that I made, just clean it up a little bit. It happens. All right. So we're going to take a lot of these same colors and get over on the other building side, get some darker shadows where they're cast, and some warmer shadows in here in the middle where it's just getting sort of a reflected bounced light and more of a glow. All right, I'm going to, while you're doing that, I'll dry this a little bit so that we feel like we're not going to drag our hand through wet paint. I'll put my dryer off to the side so that you can still see what I've done. You can probably see that my drain pipe is not perfect. It's a little wonky, a little wobbly, and we attribute that to the fact that it was installed many years ago, and it's taken a beating over the years, and so it's a little bit part of the same character of these buildings. So we're going to go, I think, to the right building, and then we'll fill in the bounce light in the middle next. So I want to try to get this a little bit darker, where there's a bit of a cast shadow on here. I'll use maybe a little smaller brush because I've got a smaller area to work within, and I want to really get that more defined. So I'm going to use a little bit of this cobalt blue and pick up a little bit of the warm violet and put it on my brush and just create a little bit of shadow right up in this corner here where it comes down to this shed roof. And as it comes around this and underneath this building, I'm going to clean my brush. This is still very wet. And I'm going to pick up a little bit of orange now and drop that right up underneath the overhang of the roof. And using this cobalt blue and warm violet, I'll add a little bit of that right out here on the edge where it comes up to this corner, and leave a little bit of white where the plants are. I've got some pipes that are coming down from the roof that are drain pipes. They come straight down. I'm just using the flat to leave that white negative shape for those pipes. And it gets a little bit cooler and a little bit darker as it drops in right behind this planting area. And then as I come back in over here underneath the shadow or underneath the overhang for the shed roof, I'm going to pick up a little bit more orange and just drop that orange right into the shadow coming down the side of the building. And then just take water and bring it right on down to this planter that's at the bottom of these drain pipes. And we're going to tuck this around right behind this little entryway that's jutting towards us. But now we've got a lot of variety within that shadow.
Randy, how did you make all those gorgeous colors in that section?
It was very wet. And when it was very wet and the wet was on my brush with the colors, I started off with a warm violet up here, with a little bit of cobalt in it, cleaned my brush, picked up a little bit of orange and put another brush stroke in there, cleaned my brush, picked up a little bit more cobalt and violet, cleaned my brush, and I picked up a little bit more of the raw sienna and the gamboge. And you're just constantly going back and forth between your palette and your painting, cleaning that brush to create these new colors that you're dropping into this big wet shape. And you're letting the water move that pigment around, and one color will automatically start blending and mixing and mingling with the adjacent color where they've touched. And pretty soon you've got this just an incredible mixture of warms and cools. Now we're not done with this. We have to cast this shadow across this rooftop. So I'm going to go back and get more of that cobalt and warm violet. And I don't want it to be, and I'm going to mix just a little bit of orange with that. So it's pretty dark, and it comes right across the edge of this roof. And I come across the leading edge of that shadow, and then I rinse my brush and I pull water towards that dark deposit of paint. So I'm allowing that dark deposit of paint to run up into this wet area. And I think I ought to get a little more cool mixed with some orange and just drop it into the wets in a couple spots. And then just take my brush that's wet and bring it from the back side of that rooftop over to the edge where that shadow is cast. And I need to bring a little bit more of that right up underneath the eave, the overhang, to make that edge get lost and become a lost edge. And I'm going to bring just a touch of it up just to suggest that these rooftops are not totally on the same plane. There's a little bit of change there in pinch between them. But you can see how that just really gives a beautiful, and I've got a lot of water is built up as a bead across the shadow. So I rinsed my brush and I wiped all the pigment off my brush with a tissue. And I just soften this a little bit. I can kind of move that pigment around and eliminate that bead so it doesn't bloom. And it becomes a very loose, and I'm going to bring some of this shadowing down through the ridges where the tile, the barrel tiles cast a little bit of shadow. So I'm breaking up that long uninterrupted edge just a little bit with a fairly dry, slightly damp brush. And we get that nice feeling. I'm going to drop a little bit of cool, neutral cool in here too, just to cool this off before it gets too warm as it goes up to the other side of the building there. There we go. We'll just leave that. And I'll come in with some more color on the middle vertical facade in a moment, but I want this to dry. So we'll just take it to this point and stop. Let this have an opportunity to kind of settle into the tooth of the paper and to dry. And if you need to, you can take a little bit of your hair dryer, and you can add a little bit of little bits of orange within that shadow. It just enriches it just that much more, and it makes it a little bit less predictable. You start to see some of these little ridges in between the tiles, the barrel tiles, just by using whatever's on your brush from that shadow and just bringing it right through from the shadow into just a suggestion of where some of these little ridges might be. And that's about all you want to do with that. You want to give it a chance to dry. Now, I said that the middle facade that tucks down into this little courtyard between these buildings has a lot of color bounce in it. It's also going to be very, very neutral. So you're going to want to take your palette. I'm going to swing over here and show you what I'm doing. Get a lot of water in your palette. And if it's too muddy, you may not like it. You can just kind of get rid of it and start over. Just take a tissue and pick that up and use some of the color you've got here. Maybe add just a touch of cool to it, but keep it pretty thin, a thin mix. Add just a touch of raw sienna to that to warm it up. Bring your attention back to your painting. And I'm going to come right down the edge and create a wet shape that tucks down, and I'm going to go kind of rinse my brush now and just bring this water or this wet brush right down across my laundry, down this vertical part of the building, tuck it in underneath some of these balconies that are poking up. And now it's wet. You don't have to worry about it too much. And I'm going to pick up a little bit of orange. Because it's wet, I'm just going to drop some of this down into the middle part of this building. Allow it to just kind of softly run wherever it wants to run. Pick up a little bit of a very diluted mixture of the warm violet and just create a little bit of warmth that comes down to this balcony. And we're going to have the same color underneath the next one and then the next one. You're going to get, and it just starts to blend with the warmer color as it goes right across your laundry. Now you can kind of see how the sunlight is angling from the upper right towards the lower left, and it's leaving this little bit of a cooler shape where we're getting some nice shadows up underneath this this rooftop, right in this little pinch here. We're going to get a little darker. I'm going to drop some nice darks up in there. And that's a nice, very transparent, warm violet. You can actually add a little bit of cobalt, maybe on the one below it, into that wet area. Clean your brush, get a little bit more of the warm violet. Allow that color to kind of come down. Clean your brush again, and just take the damp brush and just feather that wet shape around your the facade where this is casting that shadow. Now everything else in that little facade is pretty warm, so we're going to just allow that to dry by itself. But I've right up at the left edge of those cast shadows is where it gets the darkest. And I had some warmth with the warm violet at the top, but underneath these little balconies, it gets a little cooler with a little bit more cobalt in there, touch of the warm violet, but it really draws our attention to where the light is hitting this corner of the building. And as we come down into the patio, we're going to get that pretty dark and warm, but I'm going to allow this to dry before we do that. And that gives you a chance to get kind of caught up with it. I'll just take my heat gun, dry this a little bit. I might even pick up a little bit more of that value and just darken this one corner where it comes down into the shadow on the rooftop. Pull that paint color right into the rooftop shadow. All right. How we doing? Give you a chance to get that going. While you've got this cooler kind of warm violet, cobalt blue shadow mixture in your palette, don't get rid of it. Just kind of work it into your flat brush and then come over to this far side and just very gently put a little bit of a cast shadow beneath the overhang here. Just so, and then while that's wet, clean your brush, get a little touch of orange on it, and come back on the back side and drop a little bit of orange into that wet shape so that the back side of this shadow gets warmer as opposed to the cooler part that's over to the right side. I'm going to take a smaller brush and just get it a little cooler, a little darker, maybe right up in here, just to get a little darker value, and then just take water on my brush and feather that back into the rest of the shape. But you can see that just sort of really defines where the overhang shadow is, and it gets darker as it comes down, but you have a nice bounce of warm light up inside this this shadow. And that's nothing more than reflected light that bounces up into a shadow. We'll let that dry while you're finishing it up. And then we'll come back in and define the edges of the roof overhang after it dries. So. While you've got some of that warmer color, you can even make it a little warmer with some orange with just a touch of that violet. I'm going to come all the way over to the left side, or I'm sorry, the right side of my main building entrance and get right up into the pinch of that overhang and create a little bit of shadow that comes down underneath that soffit. And we'll put a little purple on the lower edge of it. All right, before we start getting into some of the defining line works of darks, I want to come back over here in my area of the painting that's not going to have as much radical value contrast. It's going to be a little less defined because it's moving off into the distance away from us, but it still needs to have a little bit of definition between light and dark. So I'm going to pick up just a very medium diluted mid-tone of orange and cut in behind this little building here and create what appears to be a little definition. And I'm going to take my shadow underneath that and create some shadows underneath these rooftops. And maybe I need to get that just a touch darker, so I'll get a little bit of burnt sienna and drop it into that wet shape. It's all going to run down to a puddle at the bottom of the shadow and the bottom of that shape. I might drop in a little shadow underneath. Well, this whole facade needs to be more of a neutral, so I'm just going to give a little bit of a mid-tone, clean my brush, and then just take it back to a very light value, because I don't want to draw too much attention to this over here. I've got a little courtyard or shape or something behind this main building. I just have to put some value back there to make it stand out. I'll use my 3/4 inch flat and get more or less the same orange color and drop in. See, I just put my palm in that wet shape. I'll get in here underneath this and create a dark that says there's a little recess in the building there that we can't really see what's going on. It's all in shadow. And it goes up underneath this, this rooftop area. And then also underneath the overhang, there's a bit of a shadow that goes back. Clean my brush and make this lighter and lighter as it moves away from the viewer, just by adding water. Get some burnt sienna and get this a little darker right up in here. We don't really know what is all going on back in there, but it just gives it a little bit more contrast to suggest that this is brighter in the sunlight. I'm going to add, while this is still wet, I'm going to use some of this burnt sienna on my brush and create that. I left a little bit of white sticking up there just to break that shape up somewhat and make it a little bit more interesting. Bring my edge of this rooftop up behind this one ridge that's coming towards us a little bit. There we go. We'll just let that dry. I'm gonna reshape my building here just slightly, get some darks up in there. And I've lost the top of part of that roof. So I'm going to take a little bit of the burnt sienna, a little bit of the red, mix it with some of the I don't know, cool midtones. And I'm just going to come in now with a little bit of dark right above that rooftop, clean my brush, and just soften this back into the background. So we just don't even see where it ends. It just, maybe I take a 1 inch and add more water to it, a little bit of blue or something. But what I've done is I've just created a subtle amount of dark back there to define what's going on behind that rooftop. And sometimes as things dry, you need to go back and reestablish things. That's all I'm doing now while you're getting caught up. So there we are. Might even drop some of that cooler color right down into this wet shape here just to get it a little darker with the blue. You know, when you add blue to orange, you just get a nice rich dark. It just darkens things up. And if this is still a wet shape, it allows you to really kind of define things. It's very subtle, but it works. All right, now that our shadows in the main part of the building have had a chance to dry, and I'm assuming yours are dry. If not, use your hair dryer and get it kind of dry so we can kind of cut back in. If we look at our sample painting or our photo reference, the terracotta tile that's on this patio is all in shadow. It's pretty dark. I want to get it darkest right behind this parapet, which is extending towards us. So I'm going to add a little bit of ultramarine to the orange that I had just mixed up for over in this other shadow. And I'm going to bring this in right behind the parapet wall to get it nice and dark and bring it right up to the edge of this building that's the little extension that's jutting out towards us. And then I'll take more orange, less blue, and come right across the upper part of that, clean my brush, get a little bit more orange and less water. And you see how it gets lighter as it goes back and it gets darker as it comes forward. And I'm going to add a little bit of red and a little bit of ultramarine, just like I did with my backgrounds here. And I'm going to bring this really rich, dark ultramarine and red right down behind the parapet wall to suggest that that is really, really dark coming towards us. It's a warm dark. And then as things recede back away from us in this little courtyard, it takes on a really nice glow because I used more of a pure orange. Now, rather than have that all defined real precisely, I've got a slightly damp round brush. And I'm just going to take that back edge, I'm going to pull it up into the patio wall, and I'm going to just soften it a little bit, run it right up into that shadow, and just blend it right up So it kind of comes up beneath some of the laundry. And all I'm doing is just dragging some of that nice, soft edge and just killing it, just basically softening everything. So we don't really see a whole lot of definition back there. It's just, we really feel the dark, rich, dark as it comes up to the edge of the parapet. And that's what comes forward. That warm dark comes towards us. The cooler or the lighter value of the orange recedes back and moves away from us. So it takes on a pretty dramatic dimension. Now, we've got this laundry, and we might as well define it a little bit more. Anytime you painted over something and you go, oh shoot, I didn't leave my white shapes for my laundry. Well, that laundry is actually in shadow anyway. So by dragging all of our shadow right across that laundry, we can now take a little bit of the warm violet, a little bit of the cobalt blue, get it kind of watered down so it's just sort of a neutral color in your palette, and not too dark, very, very diluted. And I'm just going to come right in underneath a couple of these pieces of laundry and maybe just kind of work my way around a few of these colors, clean my brush, and push my damp, clean brush up towards that darker deposit of pigment that I just dropped on there. And using the tip of my brush, I'm going to define the shape of those pieces of laundry. But you could see I pushed a clean brush up towards the underside of each of those pieces of laundry so that we really, it just very faintly runs into this warmer glow beneath it. I'm going to take a little bit more orange and add to my blue. And I'll do the same thing with this second batch of laundry that's in the remaining or the farther away string of laundry. Completely rinse my brush and take that damp brush and just push it up towards the deposit of paint that's defining the bottom edge of the laundry, and then bringing it right along the underside of the lower line of laundry. So we start to see a little bit of a shape emerging where that laundry line might be, where it just gets very subtly a little darker coming towards us. Get a little bit more warmth back in here, maybe behind that shadow on the shed roof. So we have a nice contrast. All of a sudden you thought that shadow looked pretty dark initially on the shed roof, but by putting a little dark behind it, all of a sudden we have pulled that negative shapes of the laundry out away from the rest of the shadow, and we've created another layer of negative shapes. Now we've got the remaining part that's just above. I'm just going to take some orange and just come down and just get a little bit of damp, very subtle orange shape that comes up to the balcony, and then just feather that back into the rest of it. I might need to take just a touch of blue and drop it into just, this is like dirty pigment in my my mixing well, and drop it in across the top of that laundry, which is still dry. And that darker color just diffuses up into the wet shape above it. And we have now created this string of laundry that's pretty subtle. We can add a little bit of color to it later, but for now we've accomplished everything we needed to do in creating the impression that there's some stuff in the shadows there. So let's let you get that done, and I'll come back to this later after everything dries. We'll add a few more things to it, but right now you just need to let that dry.
All of a sudden the laundry was there. How did you get that to stand out white?
Lois, I couldn't hear that very well. What was she asking?
How did you get the laundry to stand out white on your shadow background?
Yeah.
Well, if you remember, I painted the shadow right across the laundry.
Yeah.
But I made sure that that whole shadow shape between these two buildings was completely dry. Then I came back with just a very, very pale bit of neutral color on my brush that was wet. And I drop this darker color right up underneath the laundry, leaving the actual pieces of laundry dry. And then cleaned my brush and pushed the damp brush up towards that little bead of water and color that was underneath each piece of laundry, and let that just diffuse down into the shadow. And what I've done is I've just very subtly dropped in a little bit of value that's wet beneath the laundry, and that makes the laundry feel brighter. It makes it feel lighter because I've just added some darks on the underside of it, and let it diffuse back into the rest of the shadow. So it's very subtle, doesn't upstage anything. It just is adding a little element of human interest to this. It personalizes this as somebody's home, and it makes it less static. So we're going
Phenomenal,
to add
thank
some
you.
plants. We're going to add some shadows to the. Let's take some of the lighter. I'm going to work with this facade here and this facade here that's just below, kind of in our foreground. We've done this middle ground pretty well. We now need to enhance everything below here. So we want to get a little warmer as it comes forward. Everything back here had a cool element to the shadows, even though there was some warm glow within these shadows. These facades around this little patio parapet, the stairway coming down, and this big long patio, they're going to be very light. They're going to be a little bit warmer. We want to really enhance those. So I'll use a flat for those. And I think because we're working in fairly narrow areas, we'll work with a 1-inch flat that gives us a little bit more control. This is my 1-inch flat, and I'm going to clean it and make sure my mixing area is clear. Right now, my mixing area is kind of a mess. So I'm going to dip my Kleenex or tissue into some water and just wipe this all up. And that way I will be able to really get a nice, warm, clean mix. And I'll take my damp brush, pick up a little bit of raw sienna, yellow ochre, whatever you happen to be using, maybe a little bit of gamboge. It has a brightness to it. And we want to make sure that that's kind of a glaze. So we add plenty of water. And we'll come back to our painting. Get it squared up now. And I want to come down this corner so I can really accentuate the fact that, and come around some of the plants. And I want this to be warmer over on the back side of the shadow. And the front side, when I say the front, closest to where the light source is, I want this to be a little darker. So I'm picking up a little bit of raw umber just to give it a little darker cast. And I'll just take water now and dilute all the rest of this and pull it downhill towards the bottom of this facade. And because this is just a big lake of water, I can drop in darker darks with raw umber and get sort of that patina. I want to establish a little edge here. So I'm going to get a little bit of warm violet mixed with my raw sienna, just to get this nice and dark down in here to create that edge. Come around some of the planting area that's going to be along the edge there. Clean my brush, perhaps get a little bit of turquoise, kind of a light turquoise, drop a little of that in there, a couple places. Clean my brush and just make sure that this all just kind of softly blends together nicely. That little bit of orange goes a long way. So I'm going to add a little bit of that in a couple of spots in this wet shape, and let the water just kind of move around and come down along my edge of my steps. Yeah, just a touch of blue in here, a little cobalt, just to get this a little darker. Rinse my brush. Just make sure it all blends together so it's a very soft transition from a darker value that's a little cooler to this lighter value over on the left.
If you could pause a moment after you've done this little bit, because people got a bit sidetracked with the laundry.
Okay. There's no need to rush through this. We'll just take your time. And
It's quite handy that you can do one wall at a time, actually, isn't it?
right, right.
Somebody's asking, when you clean your brush, do you just dip it in the water or do you wipe off the color?
I use a fairly shallow mixing water well, and I kind of bang my brush on the bottom of it. It knocks the color loose, and then I swish it around. And I usually, like, well, I'll show you. I have a, if we can get it out of this holder here. I have a couple of things of water. I have a rag that I wipe my brush on, but I'll just bang my brush on the bottom of this, wipe my brush off, and then I can bring it back and I can mix pretty easily whatever I need. Or I just kind of do a quick little rinse, but I usually am always wiping my brush off so I can control how wet or how dry my brush actually is. It's so important to be able to control that so that you're not too wet or too dry.
They were just asking because they say that they have to change their water so many times and you don't seem to change yours at all.
Well, I have two water containers. I have one that's very dirty, and that's the one I rinse. You know, if I've got a lot of dark paint on my brush, I'll bang my brush in the bottom of that and knock all the dirty off. And then I'll go to the next well and I get a nice fresh mix where I've got clean water. If we take a break at some point here, and I trust you're going to kind of tell me when to stop, sometimes I will change my water out if it's too dirty. But usually I have one of those water containers that always stays pretty clean because I'm only rinsing my clean brush in that just to get all the last bits of paint off. So, all right, how are we doing? We ready to go to this next couple of little...
Let's do another wall.
Okay, let's do another wall. We're going to do just a very light beige. I'm going to get underneath this little architectural detail. We got a couple of them coming down, and I'll just start pulling this down behind and come up to this edge here of this parapet, and I'll get a little bit of cool color, and I've got just a very diluted bit of cobalt in my palette mixed with a mixture of raw sienna and orange, and I just want to get this warmer corner to feel like it's coming towards us. Rinse my brush, kind of drag it across, soften some of these edges, and tuck this around so it's moving behind this other little stairwell that's coming towards us. And I'll just start pulling some of this orange down into the backside here. Rinse my brush so it's just wet, and allow this, and then I'll get a little bit of burnt sienna maybe to really punch up this corner so it feels like it's up against a light, you know, the light's hitting this one edge of the parapet wall. So we'll just add that little bit of burnt sienna and because this is all wet, it just runs everywhere. It looks just kind of soft and has a nice quality about it. I want to get a little bit of red in here too, I think, because I want that warmth to come forward. So I'll just pull a little bit of red into that stucco. Stucco may not have red in it, but this is my painting and I can make my stucco any color I want. And I like to be creative with the colors. And we'll just make that really nice, warm. It's not so dark, but it has a warmth, and the warmth is what brings it towards the viewer. And now, while that's drying, let's see, I want to take a round, get it just slightly damp. And I'm going to soften this edge so that we don't feel like it's a hard edge. It's just sort of suggests that it's a shadow underneath a little bit of a ridge in the stucco. I want to get a little bit of shadow coming down these stairs. So I'll take some of that quinacridone violet, warm violet, and I want to just kind of come down and create this shadow that comes across, pick up a little bit of the orange and the burnt sienna and just run that right up into this area. Take my flat Doesn't matter which flat you use, and just soften this edge up into that wall. And pull it right on up. And what we're doing is we're just suggesting that there's a little shadow coming down those steps. I can actually add just a touch of cobalt or ultramarine and just drop that into the lower edge of the shadow to make it feel like that's the cast shadow that's coming down that stairwell. I'll probably glaze over that with a little bit of very diluted raw sienna to separate the steps from the parapet wall that's closer to us. You can also take and add a little bit of shadow underneath this this little facade, come right down the side. Add a little bit of raw sienna. Rinse my brush and just soften it as it moves back and leave that dry along the edge so we see that angle to it. But I might break up part of that little dark and then carry just a little bit of a shadow underneath it towards this other wall. So we'll let you kind of get caught up on that, but it helps us. And I lost my white on here. I can always retrieve that with some magic eraser and bring that forward. Not a big deal. We're going to do the same effect that we did with the stairwell, coming down with some shadows over here on right here. I'm pointing to where I'm looking. That's got to have a very similar type shadow. So you've already got a lot of that pigment mixed up in your brush, or I mean your mixing well. So I'm going to take advantage of that, add a little bit of cool to it, and then get some of that warmer orange and just let it get really warm as it moves away from the shadow edge of that. Bring this shadow over, bring it down the side of this a little bit and just soften it. And then behind there, I want to get that even cooler and darker. Cool kind of recedes. So we want this to be a little darker in the back, and then just feather away the edge as it gets lighter, moving away. All right, here we go. And we'll attack this this patio on this other piazza or whatever they call it, this little balcony, in a moment after everything's dried. It's still pretty wet. I hope everybody's learning how important it is to work wet and let the water kind of move things around for you. You get this really soft movement of shadow and light across the surface without having to do a lot of picky, messy brushwork. By letting the water pick those pigments up and move them naturally. And incidentally, I've got my board elevated. It's up about, I don't know, 1.5 inches on the top, coming down to the tabletop surface at the bottom, which encourages and promotes the movement of the water across the surface of the paper. And that's what grabs this pigment and moves it around and allows things to blend right on the paper. You get these really kind of interesting.
Do I do it to stop the video?
Say it again. Was there a question? All right. So next thing we're going to do is work up in this. I'm going to go to a different part of the painting to let this all dry. So we'll work up in the upper right area of the painting on that facade. And I want to try to really keep this pretty soft. So I'll get a big brush, get a little bit of this red, and we'll just, it's going to be very wet. So I'm just going to come down over the top of the surface and allow it to get a little bit darker as it cuts in behind this rooftop that's here in the middle right. And I'm just going to bring this down to create a negative shape out of a building shape that's sort of not all that well defined off on the center right of the building. Get it increasingly cooler by adding just a little bit of the more neutral pigment in my well, as I drop this into this shape behind this parapet wall. And I'm going to get maybe a little bit of the cobalt and a little bit of the warm violet, and just allow these colors to get a little darker right down in this little pinch here. Rinse and clean my brush, wipe it off, pick up a little bit of the water that's up in here, move it over to the lower area, just so we get a little more dark that's tucking in behind this parapet wall. And if you need to adjust your parapet wall a little, you can do that. But it just makes a nice value contrast up against this really sunlit surface of this building right here where I'm pointing. We do need to add a little bit of very, very, very pale beige. And I'm talking maybe a little bit of the buff or a little bit of the Wand Brilliant #1 here, but just enough. And then add water to that so that it gets a little darker as it tucks in behind the parapet wall. But it also defines this little entry, balcony, or whatever you want to call it, that's right up here, that's going to have some planting on it. And I want to get this a little bit darker. Maybe we lose some edges down at the bottom. It just all gets kind of lost. And we're just dropping little bits of this very diluted warm violet into a puddle of water. And that just very softly gets softened and lost edges. And what we've done is we've just defined this little entry to this one building. And I've got kind of a ragged edge there, but we can clean that up with a brush edge. So we'll let that dry, give you a chance to see that fall in place. If that feels a little cool, we can always drop a little bit of orange right into that little pinch of wet. And look what that orange did. It just kind of letting it run right across all these building shapes. I don't know if you can see that water moving, but it's literally moving through that shape. And I'm just allowing it to run naturally across the surface of the paper so that it gives a gradation that accumulates behind this little parapet wall, and gives it kind of a softness that works very nicely with the painting. Go from a violet to a warm to kind of a more of a glowing orange, and it's all very neutralized though. Okay, while we're letting that dry, go ahead and get that attacked. I'll let that, use my heat gun on that just to kind of evaporate some of that excess water. Gives it a chance to settle down into the tooth of the paper. And I'm going to work on this. I want to keep this facade in the lower right corner of the paper pretty subtle, not real defined. So, but it needs to be warm because it's in the foreground. What happened to our picture here? Let's see if we can get that back. We back? There we are.
That's good, thank you.
Am I squared up in your viewfinder?
That's good. Stop.
Camera doesn't stop when I tell it to stop.
Stop.
All right, anyway, we're going to work on this lower right here. And I want that to have some feel like stucco, maybe some stonework, who knows, but it needs to be pretty light, pretty watered down. And I also want to really define an edge where this is all more or less a surface that's vertical, and it butts in at a perpendicular angle to this little stairwell thing. So we want to try to just drop in some wet shapes here with mostly water with a little bit of warmth in it. And I'm just going to come across the bottom edge of this little detail, and we'll just drop this down, let it get a couple of vertical strokes. Some of these are just nothing more than water, but it's going to tint that white paper just enough that it creates a little bit of variety. I might even add a little bit of the violet in there just to create some vertical runs. Maybe add a little bit of turquoise in a couple of spots just to kind of warm it up. in a few areas there. And then add a contrasting color with some orange, just adding a little bit of orange down in part of these areas as we get farther over to the left of the painting. Maybe even put in a little bit of burnt sienna underneath this little cornice area. But allow the water to take this rich pigment, and some of that burnt sienna next to that violet makes a really beautiful contrast. I'm going to take my misting bottle and just give it a quick, I'm going to put another roll of tape underneath my board so I have a little bit steeper angle, and I'm going to squirt it and let that water pick that pigment up and run it downhill at a very loose, runny direction. And then I'm going to wick up the puddle that accumulates along the bottom edge of the paper so that we just get this really soft, wet and wet run look. And I'm tipping my paper so it's almost at a 45-degree angle to get this pigment to run downhill at a fairly consistent vertical direction. And I can come back with my brush, and I'm going to pick up a little bit of I'm going to clean my brush first of all, and get a little bit of this warm green and drop a little bit of that in there. It's almost like a mossy color next to some of these other colors in there. But it also continues to warm this up a bit. Take a little bit of the cooler turquoise, run some water, just drag my brush vertically down through this to give it some direction. And then maybe a little bit of the cooler violet in a couple of spots. And because my board has got a little bit more angle than it did before, you can see the water is actually moving vertically down across this wet shape. And it is very, very wet. So what I'm trying to do is give a very transparent, very subtle, very light bit of color on this facade that's closest to the viewer, because we don't really need to have a lot of definition here. We just need to get it pretty transparent. So I can come back in and give it another quick little squirt to keep that color running and moving down across the surface of the paper. And what this does, the little bit of moisture that the misting bottle injects to the surface of this shape lifts that paint and gets it running across the surface without it sticking to the surface, without it dropping down into the tooth of the paper. And it just gives it an amazing transparency that when it dries, it'll be very, very subtle. And we want it to be warm because warm precedes, warm comes forward, but we also want it to be pretty subtle. So I'm going to also take a rigger that's just got clean water in it and just drop some droplets onto that surface just to create a little bit of textured patina. Nothing a brush can do. The water repels the paint and creates these little dewdroppy starbursts of lighter area where the pure water hit that pigment, and it sort of repelled the pigment in a couple places. You may need to wait a little bit for that color to kind of settle down, stop running before you sprinkle any water on there, because otherwise it just continues to run downhill and it gets a little bit more runny. So I'm going to take my brush, take one of the rolls of tape out from under my board, and then hit it with some of this pure clean water from my rigger, just so I get sort of a starbursty bunch of dewdrops on that surface that creates a nice soft appearance. I'm going to clean my flat, totally clean, and I'm just going to create a little bit of, I'm going to soften some of these edges along the top in a few places and pull them up towards the plants that will be along the upper edge of this. And all I'm doing, I'm not trying to make it perfect. I'm just breaking up that edge a little bit. And we'll come after I put the patio terrazzo tile or the pavers in there with some darks like we did with this other patio. Then we can come in and put some plants in there. So, but I've got to let this dry, and I want you to have a chance to really experiment with this a little bit. Try different colors. I've got some orange, I've got some warm violet, I've got some turquoise, and I have some really warm apple green. That apple green kind of blended with the raw siennas and oranges, and it's creating a very, very subtle, soft shape across there. No hard edges, just very loose. And then later, I'm going to come in and put some very subtle stonework on there, but this has to be totally dry before we do that. So it's an opportunity for me to just get this underpainting established that suggests a lot of weathering, running. The rain has created rust and things that have run down the side of the building that gives it a verticality that's kind of nice. So we'll let that settle down and then come back to some of these other building shapes. While we're waiting for that to dry, and I'm not using my hair dryer on this or heat gun, I'm letting it dry kind of naturally, because when you use heat on this, a lot of times it bakes that color, and we want this to be just sort of a natural finish and give as much glow as possible. One of the things I suggested earlier is if I glaze over some of these steps with my smaller flat, I've got this little inch and, or I mean, 3/4 inch flat. I'm going to get just a very, very pale bit of raw sienna and just very lightly suggest that there's a bit of tone. Where's my tissue? Wipe some of this water off. And all that did was suggest that there's these steps go back behind this parapet wall. You can see I'm just dropping a little bit of orange in there, and it just darkens that very subtly and leaves this white stripe of the edge of the wall facing the light source. And that just gives us a nice separation. I could drop in a little bit of burnt sienna in a couple of spots. Maybe I run it across some of the steps there, just to give a suggestion of that light and shadow. All right, let's work on this little bit of roof over here. I'm going to take some of this color that's in my palette already, a little bit of orange and burnt sienna, and I want to come right along the edge of this hip roof, put a little bit of color in there, and then just feather it away with water. And then maybe come across the ridge just with a suggestion of a little bit of color there. And then also get part of this chimney with a little color on it so that it feels like it's got some light and shadow to it as well. And then I'll come back in underneath this guy and just take water and just kind of soften this so it pulls down to this parapet wall. And it just darkens it. I might even pick up a little bit of the neutral color in my palette and just get a little darker over towards the edge of the paper. So it keeps our eye more in the middle of the painting instead of pulling us off the painting. And it just kind of breaks that wall up a little bit. All right, let's try to see where we go next. Let's think about getting a little bit of tone on this entryway. We're going to use that same light value, come in with just a touch of shadow underneath there. And then back and behind this, we have a little bit of dark. Clean my brush and just feather that away. This is all going to be greenery and plants there. I'll take a little bit of burnt sienna and create just a touch of shadow underneath this shape that's like a cornice. Whoop. We'll rinse our brush and just pull that down. And I want to get a little darker behind that parapet wall so it pushes it back. Get a little bit of blue back in there as well. And I'm using pretty wet paint, so I can pick up a lot of that where it recedes down the surface of this wall from the upper edge. But I like that dark back there. It makes this whole surface come forward. What we're eventually going to be moving into with my 1-inch brush is the horizontal surface of this patio. But I'm going to have plants along the ridge of this railing, so I don't want to bring everything down to the perfect flat surface. I'm going to get a little bit of ultramarine and a little bit of burnt sienna, maybe a little bit of the pyro red. And I want to kind of come down and around where I have some plants, get a little bit more water on my brush, and then leave some of the negative shapes for the plants. And then eventually come right down along the parapet wall, clean my brush, and pull the damp brush towards the dark deposit of paint. And when it hits that darker deposit of paint, I'm going to drop in some blues and some other colors in here. But it's because my board is elevated, all this water is going to run downhill towards the inside edge of this parapet wall and remain very dark. And the warm dark is what comes forward. The cooler colors as it moves back away from us pushes it back. So we feel like it's more distant. I'm going to come back in here with a little bit of cool. That's mostly water. It looks dark, but it's mostly water. And I want to leave a few spots here for some more plants, those little negative shapes, and drag this across. And I'm going to take some of this dark and just blend it back up into the patio, pull some of the warm colors over into the blues, straighten up the edge of my parapet wall, and go back in and add a little bit more dark, add some of that blue and the burnt sienna, get them nice and a rich dark, and really drop some of that dark in a couple of spots right along the edge here. Clean my brush, rinse it off, wipe it off, and I can just kind of soften. I want to blend some of this right up into that wall a little bit. There we go. I'm dropping little bits of really nice, rich, dark paint that's dry right into this wet, and it starts softening, but it remains in a couple of nice little spots. So it adds texture to the wall surface. Add a little bit of dark up in here. And this is all in shadow. So I'm going to introduce a little bit more dark coming across there. And we need to let this dry. So I'll give everybody a chance to do this. We'll watch the big puddles of water as they start to settle down. If they remain as a puddle, take a small, a damp round brush and use it to kind of wick up some of the excess bead of water so it doesn't start creating big blooms. But you want this to remain as a very soft shape that goes across here and feel like it's horizontal and not a vertical plane. So in order to make that feel like a horizontal plane, you want it to be very dark along the leading edge and then get lighter as it moves back. And I'm going to create some little vertical marks on this back side of this parapet wall once this dries, so that it feels like it's part of the same. We can just take a damp brush maybe and pull some of that dark surface right up like that. It just creates some really subtle bits of indication that it's a vertical surface. If you have a few of those little lines like that. I'm going to take a little bit of the raw umber, the raw sienna, and just drag it down part of this building and just darken this a little bit, because I want my lightest lights to be here, here, and here, these three spots across here. And if I continue to compete with these lighter areas with this, it's pulling my eye off the paper.
Randy,
So
could you talk about the direction of light and the brighter walls, please?
yeah, the light is coming from the upper right, angling down across, like a sun, and it's hitting these surfaces that are facing the light. So anything that's not facing the light is going to be in shadow. And that's why we've created these neutral, kind of warm, glowing surfaces that are in shadow, and really highlighted the negative shapes of the brighter white where the sunlight is actually hitting little chimney stacks, the facade of this building directly. And it's also casting shadows across some of these surfaces to really make them feel much darker. But you have to be able to have negative shapes come forward. And that's what's happening here. And it's happening with this little parapet wall. It's happening with this little wedge of building. It's lighter, so it's coming towards us. And we're pushing back with this facade by making this a half step darker than this, so that this patio feels like it's protruding towards us. So those are little tricks that the painter has to employ in order to really make things feel like they are three-dimensional. If we don't do this, everything still remains very, very flat. So you've got to take these opportunities to exaggerate the light and shadow, which is what the viewer interprets as three-dimensional. So at this point now, I want to create a little bit of a shadowed edge underneath this. It's pretty dry. So I'm just going to put a few little indications on here that says that there's a little bit of an edge on this cornice. I'm going to take it doesn't matter which round you use, but I'm using a kind of a medium to small round. And I'm going to pick up some warm apple green color. And I'm going to create a little bit of green in a few spots. That's a kind of a nice warm green. Leave a few negative shapes, and then soften the back edge of some of these little greens that I put on. And as I soften them, I'm dragging a little bit of a damp brush away from the edge of that green, wetting the bottom part of these little shadow shapes of green. I'll drop in some darker, like a cool green with some ultramarine to it. So it really gets a little darker down in the shadow shapes beneath some of these green plants. Rinse my brush and just touch the bottom edge of some of these darks with a little bit of damp water. And all of a sudden you can create little bits of shadow that come down that facade just by hitting it with a little bit of water. And we've created a nice kind of a suggestion of greenery without having to do a whole lot of work. I'm going to do the same thing over here. I'm going to add some darker cool green with a little bit of maybe cobalt. This is the shadows looking up into some of these plant shapes. Rinse my brush, soften some of them so they pull up into the lighter negative shapes. Pick up a little bit of that really nice warm green and throw a little bit of that on in a couple places. So it just says, oh yeah, there's lots of greenery on parts of this parapet wall. Everybody, Lois, when you walk through Luca, aren't there lots of plants everywhere?
There are on top. Yes, it's very interesting.
This is what we're doing here. We're adding little bits of this to simulate how people tend their little gardens. They have their little rooftop gardens that are nice and have some greenery. I've got some of that apple green bleeding into the darker value of the ultramarine, and it's creating really nice little tendrils. So you never know exactly what's going to happen, but when you drop a clean bit of the warm green next to a really dark color, they react, and you start getting these beautiful little blooms of the dark up against the lighter green, and it just is a beautiful solution. And I'm going to put a little bit more of this lighter mid-tone value in there, and then just throw some water in there. You just let the water kind of move the pigment around, see what happens. Once this starts to kind of settle down, I might add a little bit of red here and there, but right now I just want to get the base colors of some of these greens in to suggest that there's nice bit of planting on this parapet wall. And then we've also, on these other balconies over on the other side, we have the same thing occurring. So I'll start with the warmer color, add a little bit of that, and then just drop in a little bit of ultramarine underneath it and see how it reacts up against that warmer, lighter green. It'll start pulling some of that warmer green into the blue, and it'll create a really beautiful little changes. And then I'll add a little bit of the verdigris or hooker's green, a cool green to some of these colors, and just to suggest a little more greenery. Maybe some of that greenery goes all the way across some of these balconies. Some of this just disappears, gets wet and runs downhill. Doesn't matter how perfect it is. It's just in a couple spots. Maybe we put a little bit of green down in this lower part of the patio in a few spots. But it's all in shadow, so it's not going to be too defined. It's just very loose. And just use water to kind of let these things run and just run right into the patio, so that we don't really see where one begins and one ends. It's all just a very loose, soft bits of lights and darks. I'm going to go back into this little dry, where it's dried a little bit, and drop in some darker darks in a few spots. All right, so that's that. We'll let that dry. We'll get some shadows underneath some of these balconies over here on the left. And but while we're waiting for that to dry, I think what we'll do is we'll maybe take a small flat, pick up just some really diluted color that's like neutral, and just put a few little suggestions of some stones. Don't put too many, because it's so easy to get carried away and put too much. But I'm just going to put a couple of these little stones in here, and I'm going to change the color up to more of a green, like a plant green, and introduce a little bit of that into some of the colors, so that it just gives a variety. What else should I use here? Let's try a little bit of raw umber. Come back over, and maybe over in here, we'll add a little bit of stonework. Add a little bit of green color to it. Maybe soften this, and just, you're not trying to be real obvious. You're just trying to very subtly suggest that perhaps there is some stonework on these walls. Maybe you got some vertical stones that are in here that, if you don't like it, just take a tissue and pick it up. Leave just a remnant behind that just suggests there might have been an edge here or there that defined part of the wall. All right, now I'm going to use a little bit of neutral color with just I think I've got a touch of dark in there, and I'm just going to come down along the edge of this wall and create a suggestion of maybe some shadows. They don't need to really go to anything, and something else out of the frame might be casting this shadow. But what it does is it just sort of defines the directionality of the patio. And you can break it up. Doesn't need to be continuous across there. Put a little bit more greenery in here. And then maybe there's a more of a terracotta, warmer color underneath some of these. That would be where a pot might be or something. Just a few little darks here and there that are warm. We can even take a little bit of water and push up and have some of that running down the edge of the walls, just to break them up. All right, while you're letting that kind of percolate a little bit, look for places where you can punch up your darks. Some of you are already caught up, others of you are doing this, but I'm going to take a little bit of ultramarine and burnt umber just to make kind of a dark. And I want to come back in and define a few of the risers on my stairs to be just a little bit darker, clean my brush and push that damp brush towards the deposit of darker paint so it softens them. And all we're doing is defining how it kind of moves across that vertical surface. I'm going to drop a little bit of dark in along the edge of the wall there just to kind of define that a little bit more. We can now, I'm going to let you get caught up, and when we think everybody's ready to go on the next step, we're going to start doing some trim, some of the little detail things that really make this thing come to bring it together. So I think you can see how things are starting to take shape. We still don't have some of our final darks in yet, and we're going to be putting those in a moment. So that's what's next. I'm mixing up a little bit of orange and ultramarine and a little bit of the red. Remember, that was our really dark color in the background, but I'm making a really warm dark. The ultramarine just takes it down in value, but the red and the orange keep it lively and warm. And I'm going to come back in and just now put one of these really dramatic little drain pipes that come off the eave. I'm going to rinse my brush so to get all that darker value off, and I'm just going to very lightly suggest it as it goes down the hill or down the slope of the building, break up some of the value so it just disappears. And I'll use that same color to create a little bit of suggestion of where some of these little chimney stacks are. Clean my brush and then come right off the bottom of that chimney stack dark and give sort of a jagged little shadow line, because remember, the shadow is casting across these little rolls of barrel rolled tile. They're not going to be real perfectly straight shadows. They're going to have a little zigzag to them. The one that's up here at the top, I'm going to just pick up the bottom part of it, leave the negative shape going up into the dark background, and just suggest a little bit of that shadow skipping across a couple of those darks. Right along the bottom edge of my overhangs, I'm taking my rigger, which has the same dark on it, and I'm really punching in some nice darks. Pick up a little extra ultramarine in a couple of places to make it even darker. And then once I've got a really nice orange and ultramarine, maybe a little bit of burnt sienna mixed with that, I'm going to take my edge of the tip of my rigger and push it up in a couple of spots just to suggest the underside of some of these barrel tiles that are making up the rooftop. And I'll come across some of the others, and I don't want to make them too exact. I want to keep it pretty random. So it just suggests little bits and pieces of those darks that are tucking in underneath the roof. Clean my brush and maybe tickle the bottom of this wet dark that has just been put in as part of our rooftop barrel tiles, and then just feather that back into the wall with the whole heel of your rigger so that that dark just starts floating down across the facade and just warming it up even more. But what it does is it really pushes the dark up to a dramatic conclusion right up along the bottom edge of the barrel tiles. And you can see how warm this is when you add a little bit of water to the bottom edge of those darks and allow it to trickle down into your shadows or the facade beneath it. And I'm just going to work my way very gently across some of these rooftops to get the same similar type effect in a few places, not trying to be too consistent, but it still is the same shadowy shape. So some places it'll be more obvious, other places it'll be more subtle. But what this does is it really helps us, kind of put an exclamation point on the bottom of these rooftop edges where the barrel tiles come together to create the shape of that overhang. Come down here in this little shed roof thing, we'll do the same thing, just kind of come across the bottom edge. And these little darks just are amazing how they bring everything together to really kind of give it a final little kick of accent. And you don't need to soften all of them everywhere, but just in a couple of places, maybe you soften that edge where it comes down to a corner. We're going to also pull some windows out of all this too in a little bit. But we've got these drain pipes over here in the middle right. I'm going to take a little bit of a cooler color and come down parts of these, like where the shadow would be over the overhang, and just get a little bit of a cooler at the top, and then maybe a little bit of warmer as we come down. Whoops, that still had too much blue on it. A little bit of gamboge or something on this to just warm up some of the shapes coming downward. And then pick up some of that dark shadow that we use on the barrel tiles, whatever you've got in your palette. And you've got a couple of these penetrating the roof, a couple of little stacks, vent stacks, and we'll just kind of create a little bit of shadow coming off of those as well, the same way we did with the other shadows. I'm going to get a little bit of really dark, deep, warm, burnt sienna and orange, not a lot of blue in there, and just push it right up underneath this little bit of shadow on the roof in the building behind, and then just soften with water the lower edge of that dark that we just put in there, so that it creates a really nice contrast to the light that's on the rooftop itself. Maybe this one we put a little bit of the blue in. I don't know. Yeah, I like that. Kind of pushes it back up in the shadows there. That works. Come in underneath this little divot or whatever, that little architectural detail, put a little shadow in there. And so now we're going to stop and kind of evaluate that, see how we look. I'm not sure what happened here. We got a lot of bleed out. So I'm just going to take my brush and pick up some of this dark and blend it into the wall so it's not so obvious. There we go. And we need to dry these. All this little bit of darks we want to dry. So otherwise they may take a chance and run on you and do things you're not expecting. Take a little bit of that Wand Brilliant #1, just put it on a piece of a card here. So I don't know if you can see that. I just put a little bit of it on my paper, this little extra piece of scratch paper. But I'm going to come and just drop a little bit of this at the bottom edge of this one surface that's facing the sunlight, and then add just a little bit of raw sienna toward the bottom of that shape. So it feels like that surface is getting gradually just a little bit warmer, a little bit darker as it comes down to the bottom of that surface, and then feather that away as it goes up. So it just contributes to the feeling that that's getting a little darker as it runs down towards the floor or the base. That works. All right, now I don't think I need it anywhere else. Let's think about some windows at this point. What do we want to do for? I'm going to use probably my rigger, because I can get a better performance out of a rigger for some of these smaller deals. I'm going to take some sap green to start with. And sap green is a very warm green, kind of a yellowy green. And I'm just going to lay it down right up in this area where there's some shutters. And it doesn't have to be a perfect mark. It doesn't even, come to a conclusion at the bottom of the shapes that's perfect. But it really kind of does a nice job. And I'm going to do a little of the same thing. We got a window that's got two shutters closed on this window, and I'm just going to bring it downward, clean my brush, get a little bit more water on this, and maybe add a bit of shutter over here on the side of this guy. Maybe these are open. And using this warm green, it just does a nice job of kind of suggesting. These are window panes down here. Clean my brush and get a really nice dark rich color. I'm going to get some ultramarine blue, a little bit of the orange mixed with that. So I have a nice rich dark. I'm going to create just a couple of little dark window panes without being too perfect, just to suggest the dark shapes of where those windows would be. Maybe take my back of my brush and just drag it vertically down one side of those windows. Maybe this comes up into this other area. We just take a wet brush and we get this a little wetter up into the shadow. So it's not all perfect. And we certainly don't want all of our windows to be identical. We want a lot of variety to appear within those window shapes. So I'm getting a little drier bit of ultramarine and a little drier bit of orange on my brush. So I have more control. And I'm just going to put a little bit of these little rectangular shapes without being too precise where these windows might be. And then maybe down below, we'll just have a bigger window that comes down a little lower. Maybe there's some darks in and around this shutter. Maybe there's some little sills that we put on here with a rigger, just a very subtle little line that creates some kind of nice darks that are not perfect. The more perfect you make them, the more they may not look like windows. So I'm just trying to throw some darks in here that are very subtle. As we get back over above the balconies, we're going to put in a little bit of dark facing the sunlight. Get some dark right along the edge of that. Let it hit some of those wet shapes. So it just gives a suggestion of some doors or windows that are along this sort of, it's such a steep angle, we can't really see a whole lot of detail there. And then once you get in the shadows, the windows are very, very subtle. We don't really see a whole lot. I might even use a little bit of cool purple and just create a suggestion of a window shape. Over up above, maybe we've just got a couple of things coming down where there's a window. And then we get some nice rich darks that are cool, a little bit drier. Again, if it's too wet on a rigger, it's just going to go everywhere. So you want to have a fairly dry little mark on your riggers so you can make these more subtle window shapes. This one might be a little more defined. It's a little closer to us. All of a sudden, this building is starting to take shape. We got a kind of a lighter window down here. We're going to put something down, just almost water. Doesn't need to have much. And then over in here, we'll take some green maybe, and we'll put some window shapes in here that I don't like that. So we'll just lift that up, let it dry, and I'll come back in and do something else. We'll get some of this blue and we'll put maybe something right in here. And then take our rigger, just drop two verticals in here to suggest a window pane in between them, and you've got a nice window shape there. I'm going to clean my brush and get some warm color, some very kind of subtle orange, not real dark, but I want to create some windows over in the pure light that are coming out of these shadows. They don't need to be real defined. There's just a couple of little tick marks of shapes that suggest that there's some windows, and we'll put a few little things over along some of these buildings here, just give it that suggestion. We've got some other windows underneath this laundry. I'm going to get a little darker in here, just down inside there. Maybe we got some back behind the laundry there. It just builds depth when you start adding a few of these little subtle darks on top of each other. I've got a little bit of a shadow underneath these awnings. Keep it pretty subtle, almost transparent, but it leaves the brighter portion up above it. Where else do we need to figure on something? We talked about putting a little bit of red in some of our plants. we can take our rigger and pick up a little bit of a warm red, and maybe put a few little dots of red in a couple of spots here. But then don't leave them just big dots. Just take your brush and just soften it, hit part of it with a little bit of water so that it blends from an intense saturated red to a very subtle, barely there red. And it just gives it a nice variety that suggests reality as opposed to just something that's too defined. I think that works. Put a little bit of red over in here. Clean our brush. Drag a little bit of that red right up on the side of the building so that it feels like a little bit of reflection, and maybe a little bit of red somewhere up in the balconies. But that little touch of red just warms things up a little bit. See if we can get down closer. You can see what I just did. Come back in with a brighter bit of red. Just drop a few things in here. I think that works. Back it up. That looks pretty good. Okay, now I'm going to throw a little bit of just real subtle, maybe some splatter. Whoops, that's too big of a splatter. So we'll get a little finer and maybe make some of that orange. Maybe put a little bit of it across this building here. I'm going to put some windows on the main wall that's getting all the light. We'll take a little bit of red, mix it with some of those other colors, and we'll just put maybe one window right here, just a slash. And I'm looking to see what else they've got. They've got a doorway. I'll put a little dark down below it. We'll clean our brush and just add a little water to the right side of that opening. And then I'm going to get a drier bit of ultramarine and go right up in the corner and add some darks. So it changes from a cool dark to a light, to a warm red or warm color as it goes down the length of that door opening. Maybe some of these closer to us get a little darker as well. Put a little dark in there. I talked about coming back and redoing these windows here. I'm going to put some dark, maybe make these into shutters or something. But it just kind of makes it fun. Now, as we dry this, there's things you want to retrieve. I don't know if any of you brought a magic eraser and masking tape, but I want to get the paper completely dry. And there's a few spots on here that I want to restore some whites, just little tickles of white, so that we can really punch this up a bit and get it straight. And that's where this magic eraser really comes in handy. It's a high density, dense foam. Here's what it looks like. Just a foam eraser, no soap in it, nothing. I just cut off a little piece of it. I don't need the whole thing. So I've got a little piece like that. And then I'll take a little piece of masking tape and across the one of these little, first of all, I don't want to get too much stickum on here. I'll just take and expose part of my parapet top, which is in sunlight. Get the little magic eraser wet, squeeze all the water out of it. I shake it off so that I don't have wet fingers either. And then I just very gently come across the exposed part. This is so much simpler than masking something off. And then when I pick the tape up, and I save the tape because I'm going to use it again, I've just exposed a little bit of a whiter area there. And if there's other areas that I want to kind of clean up and give a little brighter white to, like part of this parapet wall here, I can just expose just the part that I want to make a little bit brighter. And I'll come back in and just pick that up, and it lifts just that quickly and provides a little whiter white across the top edge. And back here, I want to definitely do it. It got a little away from me. when I was painting this wall. So I want to give a little bit of a white edge in a couple of spots here. And I don't need to have a hard stop and start and stop. I just want to give a little glow across the top of this parapet wall. So I picked that up and it just lifts it a little bit in a couple spots. If you want to clean up an area where you might have painted over something, it's not that hard to do. You can squeeze all the water out and just lift any paint that got into a shape that you don't want to have destroyed. Now, we still have our little drain pipe that's coming down the side of this building that's really kind of interesting. So I'm going to take some of my darks, get a little bit of the burnt sienna, and come back in and really kind of add some crisper darks in a couple of spots coming down this wall, and then create just a suggestion of a shadow that's coming on the underside of this thing. Tickle the bottom edge of it. So we have a hard edge at the top of that mark and a softer edge at the bottom edge of that mark. So it feels more like a shadow. And then coming up the vertical surface, we could do even something that's a little drier. We'll take a little drier orange maybe. And
Randy, does Magic Eraser have another name? Because someone's saying that she can't find it in the shop.
Depending on where you are in the world, it's just a real high density foam, and I'm not sure what people call it. If you're here in the United States, you can get it through Home Depot. It's called their HDX Magic Eraser, and I've had trouble finding it in some of the supermarkets, and I have better luck finding it at the hardware stores. But it's just designed to kind of take fingerprints off of your light switches. If your kids get fingerprints on the walls, it takes the fingerprints right off. And us painters have discovered how useful it is in picking up, paint without having to scrub your paper and have your paper dissolve in front of you. So I'm just putting a few little tick marks on the.
You can buy it on Amazon in England, no problem.
And also an SAA. They make it specially for painters.
Oh, cool.
SAA, Magic Eraser.
There you go. Ask and you shall receive, right? All right, there's I think now if you want, you could put a few little tracks of suggestions of shadows where some of the barrel tiles are. I wouldn't get it too wet though. I'd keep a fairly dry brush and keep it more on the orange. Right now my rigger is too wet, so I'm trying to dry it off to get more of the darker burnt sienna shadow shapes. And I can come back in and just put a few of these little lines in here that suggest where some of the tile shadows would be between the barrel tiles. And you don't want to do it everywhere, but just give a suggestion here or there, and it does wonders. And then you can also, right atop the ridges of of these buildings, they have little bits of dark running parallel with the ridge because it's right underneath the tiles. So there you go. And it becomes a very stylized painting of an Italian village that's pretty exciting. It's fun to get to do this. It's fun to have it such an impression as opposed to something that's so perfectly, realistic. Just adding a little dark here on this guy to make it come forward, and then feathering the bottom over away. Maybe a little bit more red back in a couple of spots back in here. Clean my brush, let it just get less dark as it gets down into the light. But I think we're done. I think this is pretty much what we wanted to achieve. And it just is a fun little character in our story. I mean, we've literally turned this into a story that is pretty fun. I'm pushing the value just by just very lightly putting on some darker, warmer tones behind this parapet wall, cleaning my brush and just feathering it away. So it just feathers out and pushes it back. If you need to take an eraser, you can always, make sure your paper's dry, but you can come back in and pick up any excess pencil lines that you don't feel like you need anymore. I don't really worry about pencil lines too much, but sometimes if you get get your pencil lines too dark, it's a time to come in and pick it up a little bit and eliminate things that might have been a distraction. I've got some really dark, I've got to put some ultramarine, neutral tint, maybe some Prussian blue on the end of my rigger. And I'm going to put just a indication of a little bit of a balcony railing up on, because I'm using some really nice dark darks. You can actually see it there. But all these little things contribute to creating a nice impression. Any questions at this point?
Someone's asking, do you think you should darken the buildings on the far right a little bit or not?
No, because I really want this to be my center of interest. I want this to get more and more subtle. What I may do is take this chimney and put a little dark something there. I'm going to put a little bit of a, what do you call it? Let me get my other liner here.
An aerial.
Yeah, a little antenna thing up here. You see a lot of these, at least you used to. I don't know if you still do, but, and then you've got a little bit of a shadow coming across the rooftop.
You've
And
got satellite dishes now these days.
yeah, I'm not going to put satellite dishes in, but it just little things like this is all you need to do to kind of create an impression of fun little buildings, building shapes that are not all that defined over here. We just want to keep that fairly ill-defined as it moves away into the distance and keep all of our attention over on the left side of the building, which is really where our all the fun, the activity, everything is happening. One of the things I suggested is we could take some color. I'm going to take a little bit of turquoise and maybe put a little bit of it on one of these pieces of clothing, maybe take a little bit of red, put a little bit of red on something, and then clean my brush and then just tickle that little bit of red with some water to make sure that it softens as it comes down into the light in a couple spots. Maybe take a little bit of yellow and warm something up with a little bit of yellow. I don't know. You know, this is where you get to be creative and you can make it however you want to make it. But it's keep it subtle. It's not anything that's you don't want it to, upstage the rest of the painting. You just want to create little bits and pieces of something that suggest there might be some. I'm going to put a little blue or something on there. I don't like that, so we'll just pick some of it out. But there you go. And at the end, I purposely left this area, which is not all that important. I have all my activity over on the left. So I'm going to use my signature as really a counterbalance to what's going on over here in this quieter area. And I can come in and just kind of create a very loose, stylized signature. Right there, and that counterbalances everything. And it doesn't upstage anything. It doesn't distract anything. But I've used a lot of the same color in the signature that I've used as the dominant color in the painting. So it feels perfectly natural there, but it provides a little bit of balance. And as artists, you want to be thinking about, where do I sign a painting? Where do I try to sign it in a busy part of the painting, or do I wait and kind of find a place within the painting that might be a little quieter and ready for a little something to counterbalance it, to give it texture. It's really all about just adding some texture. It's all we're trying to do. So that that's my story. I'm going to add a little dark here on this edge just to anchor this a little bit. Drop some more red right up on the corner here. You see how that warm just pulls that towards us? Just makes it feel very close. And then I can soften it as it moves towards the back side or the left side of there. Who would have figured that we'd get this far, huh?